I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today on Inside Wheaton is Dr. Jay Wood. Dr. Wood is professor of philosophy here at Wheaton College, author of a number of books and articles. Let me mention just two or three. His book called Intellectual Virtues, which is an Oxford University Press publication. A book called very simply but profoundly, God. And I think I need to ask him about that in a minute. And then an earlier book called Epistemology, Becoming Intellectually Virtuous. Jay, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And, to sit down across the table from a philosopher is a little daunting, I have to tell you. My mind goes back to my intro to philosophy course in college. You could always tell when there was an exam coming in that class because the library floor was absolutely packed, as it never was any other time. That's what you philosophy professors bring to the table.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. In our case, it was. So let me start just by asking about philosophy in general. I think that the discipline of philosophy is one that, frankly, kind of frightens a lot of people, and especially when you think about studying it as a Christian, can be a little bit daunting and a little bit intimidating, can't it?
I think so, particularly in as much as high school students have no exposure to philosophy, or it's very rare that they have had exposure to philosophy. So their first crack at a philosophy course comes in college, and at a time when they're kind of cut loose from the traditional family moorings and church moorings, and they're holding things out at arm's length and assessing them for their own for the first time, and it's into that particular milieu that they step into their first philosophy class, which encourages them to do precisely that kind of thinking.
Right, and that outside of the box thinking can be frightening when you're still maybe in some ways fresh, determining your own faith. Is this my faith or just my parents?
Exactly so.
And then you enter those questions. Some of the tough questions of philosophy, are those caricatures, or are they really things that are frightening to turn over in your mind and explore?
Well, I mean, first of all, the question of their complexity. Yes, philosophical questions can grow increasingly complex. I think that's one of the things that philosophy does, is to show us the depths and the dimensions of particular subjects that might not appear to us at first glance. One philosopher described philosophy as thinking in slow motion, and it is precisely to attend to the nuances and to the subtleties that attach to the various subjects and questions that it considers. Can it be frightening? Yes. I mean, any time we're asked to sort of scrutinize and assess our most cherished convictions can be a time of intellectual dis-ease. And so in order to make sure that our students do that without being frightened is to provide an appropriate amount of support alongside the challenge.
Right. Which it seems to me is the strength of a Christian college, where you're allowing those students to turn that over in their head and explore these potentially disconcerting ideas, but always with that support of a Christian worldview, I suspect.
To be sure. I mean, we don't hide anything from our students. At least in the philosophy major, we have them reading the works of contemporary atheistic authors of previous centuries, Nietzsche, Hume, and lots of others. So we don't hide them from anything, but at the same time they know that if they're struggling through this material, if they're just being, if they're at sea with respect to this material, they can come and see the professor. They can spend time in my office, and we're always happy to help them work through these issues.
Talk to the person who might be out there, Jay, saying, well, wait a second, why do we do this anyway? If we know what we believe in terms of our faith, why would we read an atheistic author?
Well, first of all, for understanding. Not all of the world believes in God, and there are many long-standing objections to the rationality of religious belief that are a part of our conversation in the West for centuries. And so one of the reasons you might do that is simply to understand the Western tradition, the heritage, the development of certain kinds of ideas. So it's no surprise to anyone that the West is more secular now than it was centuries ago. Well, how did it get that way? Well, here is where we read the authors that help us to understand that progression.
Let's turn to what I is clearly one of your interests and I suspect passions in terms of study, and that is what you call the intellectual virtues. Let's start with a couple of definitions. When you say that, what do you mean?
Well, I guess I would first begin by defining what a virtue is. And a virtue is an acquired, deeply anchored habit of excellent functioning in some area of life that is challenging and important. And I think that last bit, some area of life that is challenging and important. We tend not to talk about virtuous walking or gum chewing or something like this. I mean, activities that are not particularly challenging or important. But we do think that the life of the mind, our intellectual life, our moral life, our spiritual life, our social and civic life, these are all tremendously important areas of human activity, and there are virtues associated with each of these areas. And so we differentiate between intellectual virtues, moral virtues, spiritual virtues, and civic virtues. They are interestingly connected as well. They don't exist in isolation. So intellectual and moral virtues will bear very much on how you think about social virtues such as justice and tolerance and forbearance and forgivingness.
So let's take intellectual virtues. By that, I mean, as a layman, I would hear that and think what you mean is, how do I think? Do I think virtuously? I mean, is that getting on the right path?
So an intellectual virtue would be an acquired habit of excellent intellectual functioning in the various matters that you have to confront. So it would be let me go at it from the sort of Scrutapian perspective first. Let's think about the kinds of intellectual habits you would not want to have. So nobody wants to be characterized as gullible, as willfully naive, as self-deceived, as closed-minded, as dogmatic, as unteachable. I mean, these are all traits that can take up permanent residence in the intellectual life of a person. So by contrast, we want to foster those traits that are going to open us up to truth, to deeply warranted and justified belief. So intellectual humility, intellectual courage, discernment, circumspection, teachability. These are the habits of mind that we think constitute, as Paul says in Romans 12, a transformed mind. A transformed mind will be one that is not marked by these vices of the life of the mind, but rather by its virtues.
Talk a little bit about the connection then, Jay, between that and faith. So if you take a person who lays no claim whatsoever to Christian faith, in fact, let's take an atheist, doesn't even believe in God, can that person think virtuously?
I believe so. Let me address your question about the connection of virtue to faith on the positive side first. Peter, in his second epistle, chapter 1, verse 5 says, "Make every effort to add to your faith virtue." So Peter is commanding us here to supplement faith with virtue. And the word that he uses there is actually arete, the Greek word that Aristotle used in the Nicomachean Ethics, let's say, and that subsequent Greek philosophers used to refer to virtue. Make every effort. The reason we need to make an effort is because we're not born virtuous. Yeah. These things have to be actively and deliberately cultivated and fostered. Make every effort to add to your faith virtue. Now, the question is, can somebody without Christian faith be intellectually courageous or intellectually generous or intellectually humble? And I think the answer is straightforwardly yes, just as they can be a person without faith can be morally generous and morally courageous. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that these are the distinctive province of Christians. Aquinas makes an important distinction, and he says there are natural virtues, and pagans, as he would have referred to them, are capable of cultivating them, but not to their fullest measure, not to their fullest degree. Only with grace, only with the Holy Spirit can we achieve the depth and the dimension of these virtues that were originally intended for us.
Interesting. I heard a sermon one time where the point being made was that if the discussion was about sort of an apostasy of doctrine, and the sermon was making the point that often this pastor felt when doctrine slipped, it was because of a moral lapse in a life, and he was drawing sort of a straight line connection between a moral laxity and an intellectual, or in this case, doctrinal one. Does that resonate with you? Is there a connection
Sure.
that way?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's think about the flip side of virtues, of course, are vices. And there's the famous the seven deadly vices, the seven deadly sins, so-called: pride, anger, greed, gluttony, lust, envy, sloth. And it's pretty clear, I think, to most people how if you are arrogant or conceited, Paul says knowledge puffs up. If you have an exaggerated sense of your own intellectual abilities and development, you might consider yourself immune to certain criticisms that could, in point of fact, expand your intellectual horizons. If you are arrogant, you may think yourself in a position to correct people about the mistakes in their own view, when in point of fact, you correct out of error.
Yeah, yeah. I'm going to ask you about the big word epistemology. It's an important word in philosophy, right? Talk about what that means and how it relates to what we've been talking about.
Well, epistemology is simply the study of knowledge. Episteme is one of the Greek words for knowledge, and so it's the study of knowledge. So first of all, I mean, it's thinking about the difference between knowledge and highly confirmed belief, mere belief, opinion, faith, conjectures, guesses, muses. I mean, there's a whole range of, you might say, there's a hierarchy of certainty that various of our beliefs acquire. So what level of justification, what level of reasons, what level of evidence do we have to call something an example of knowledge as opposed to mere belief or opinion or faith? So first of all, the theory of knowledge addresses just the very nature of knowledge, but it goes so much more beyond just the question of what is knowledge. It also helps us to think about what constitutes having good reasons for your beliefs as opposed to inadequate reasons for your belief. It helps us to think about the whole nature of evidence and what constitutes evidence. So if you were to ask me, why do you believe in God? And I were to respond, well, because I experienced him in prayer this morning. Somebody might say, well, that doesn't constitute evidence. Mm-hmm. Well, why doesn't my religious experience constitute a form of evidence? So we would argue about that. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of other sort of problems that epistemologists grapple with.
Yeah. And that gets very real and tangible for the Christian because we get into things like apologetics and arguing for the defense of the faith. Can
Absolutely.
we talk just for a minute about how that works for the Christian? Because there are things we say, for example, evidence is for the resurrection. There are some, but no one has proved by scientific methods the resurrection, certainly not the existence of God. Back to your question, how much evidentiary knowledge is needed to say, I believe this?
Well, I don't know. There's a difference between how much evidence an individual might require in order to say, I believe this, and I believe this justifiably. I think I'm perfectly within my intellectual rights. I think I'm doing right by way of my mind, as believing as I do. But then there's the issue of how much evidence it takes to convince somebody else. And there is the problem with the so-called proofs. No matter what kind of an argument you construct, you can always find somebody, for legitimate reasons or not, who can find one of the premises to disagree with, who can disagree with the validity or the soundness of the argument. I mean, if the proofs for God's existence were truly compelling to all persons, we wouldn't have those atheists that you mentioned a while ago. But there are conscientious, committed philosophers who examined those arguments and found them wanting. Christian philosophers have examined those so-called proofs and found them wanting. And so whether or not reasons are convincing to you depends in part on how you assess the probative force of the evidence. And here's where we can sort of look at the evidence and disagree about its force, just the way I suppose two referees at a boxing match might watch the fight round after round, and at the end of the fight, one scores it in favor of the guy in the black trunks and one scores it in favor of the guy in the white. And why do they disagree? Well, because they assess differently what they saw going on right in front of them. Similarly, jurors, sitting in a jury box, hear the same evidence presented to them day after day, but they assess its force differently. Well, that's another interesting question. Why would people assess the force differently?
And the word proof is interesting, isn't it? Because isn't it more of a post-Enlightenment kind of thought that when we say proof, we mean sort of a mathematical proof, I think, don't we, often? I can see it, here it is, there's no argument. And we get into trouble when it comes to our faith in expecting that kind of proof.
Well, exactly so. But that notion of proof, of course, is not a modern phenomenon. That's an ancient Greek phenomenon. They knew all about geometry, and mathematics was one of the, it was a part of their liberal arts curriculum. That idea of some conclusion following with apodictic certainty from its premises is a very ancient notion. But to expect that every belief meet those high standards of geometry is, I think, unwarranted.
Let's come down out of our ivory tower now. We'll make things real simple here. What kind of person should come and study philosophy at Wheaton College?
All persons should come and study philosophy.
Regardless of major.
Yeah, currently, every single student is required to take a course in philosophy here at Wheaton College. It falls to the philosophy department in every college that I can think of to teach courses, for example, in logic and in ethics. These are staples of campus curricula all across the nation. But not only that, all the other subjects that philosophy teaches, metaphysics and philosophy of religion and philosophy of science. So, philosophy in its most basic sense is thinking rigorously and in a disciplined way about life's most important questions. Is there or is there not a God? What happens to me when I die? How should I treat my neighbor? What is justice anyway? So these are the kinds of questions that are perennial. We struggle with them and we try to answer them as befits our time and our place and our perspective, generation after generation. So I think every student should be required to take a course in philosophy.
Is there a philosophy major here at Wheaton?
There is a philosophy major. That is correct.
And that person would be probably headed for what? What kind of profile would a philosophy major generally have here?
Parents who ask me, what is my kid going to do with a philosophy major? I sometimes respond, anything he or she wants, which is precisely what has been our experience in the philosophy major. Our majors go on not all to become professional philosophers by a long shot. Rather, 98, 99% of our majors go on into a wide variety of different fields: ministry, law, business, computing, you name it. It runs the gamut. But they take with them into whatever profession they go those skills of being able to read with real critical discernment, to be able to synthesize vast amounts of material, to be able to construct an argument and assess arguments, to speak clearly, persuasively, and so forth and so on. So these transferable skills, I think, are in high demand.
Jay, it's great to have you here. Thank you.
Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Jay Wood is professor of philosophy at Wheaton College, and as we've talked about students here, if you'd like to know more about the program, do visit wheaton.edu. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheatley.